With the current political situation in Eastern Europe, it is important to look back into history to see what happened to Ukraine, because very few people know what happened there. For most of its history, Ukraine was divided among powers for a long time. Their lands were annexed by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then later by the Russian Empire in the 19th century. But Ukraine got their independence after World War I for a short amount of time. After the Central Powers cut deep into Russian territory, Russia capitulated, and the stability within Russia at the time was very weak. This gave a window of opportunity for the Bolsheviks to launch a revolution to overthrow the Tsar. While this was happening, Ukrainian leaders in Kiev formed the Central Rada, which was their form of parliament. They were demanding autonomy and later full independence, and in 1918 Ukraine fully declares independence, forming the Ukrainian People's Republic. However, Ukraine was not in a good situation. For example, they didn't have their own army to protect their own people, and their economy was basically in the gutter. But as soon as they gained their independence, they had to fight. The Bolsheviks in Russia rejected Ukrainian independence because Ukraine had a lot of valuable resources that they could use. And in 1919, the Red Army invaded Ukraine. The capital of Kiev kept changing hands between Ukraine and Bolshevik forces, but in the end, the Red Army unfortunately won and took control of the city. But within Ukraine, there were multiple factions, one of them being the White Army under Anton Denikin. They were also had to face Polish forces. There were multiple factions fighting for power, but things would change in 1921 when Poland signed a truce with the Soviet Union. This allowed free Red Army divisions to be moved to Ukraine. It didn't take long until Ukraine capitulated. In 1922, Ukraine became a founding member of the USSR official republic, but it was still controlled from Moscow. We will see later how not having your own independence will hurt you in the future. Even after the war, there was still heavy resistance against Bolshevik forces in rural areas of Ukraine. After years of resistance, Lenin and later Stalin viewed Ukraine as nationalistic and potentially having separatist ideology. Ukraine was a breadbasket of the USSR, and the Soviets were not going to let a valuable resource like food be taken away from their control. But the peasant uprising didn't end after they lost the war. One of the reasons for the uprisings was because of Soviet policy when it came to land and ownership. Since their ideology was Marxist-Leninist communism, they believed all property and means of production should belong to the state, and they will distribute land and tools as they see fit. One of the ways that the Soviets dealt with uprisings was mass executions, deportations to concentration camps, and terror campaigns. All these methods were tools that helped them suppress anything they disliked, which in the most case was Ukrainian nationalism. Just to give some numbers, Ukraine produced around 30 to 40% of Soviet grain, a huge amount of food for the USSR. During the mid-20s, Lenin would die from a stroke. His successor was Stalin. After massive amounts of propaganda and political smear campaigns against his enemies, he finally secured power. And once he did, it was only going to get a lot worse for the people of Ukraine. One of Stalin's goals for the USSR was for it to become a superpower. In order to do this, he would need a lot of resources. His first target was the people of Ukraine, which he already didn't like, so he could use his goal as an excuse to genocide his population. One of his first steps in doing this was forced collectivization of agriculture, which basically meant peasants had to give up land, animals, and tools. So everything they had worked for generations was stolen from them and given to the government. And then the farms were merged into state-controlled collective farms. This was also a way for Stalin to keep an eye out for people who are not going along the collectivization plan. That way, he could take them out easily because they were all in one spot, and it was easier to track them when they were all together. A certain person in particular on Stalin's plan of collectivization was Lazar Kaganovich. He was especially hostile to Ukrainians. An example of this would be in the late 1932. Stalin sent Kaganovich to Ukraine. When grain deliveries fell short, Kaganovich accused the Ukrainians of hiding food. He ordered total confiscation of grain, which included seed grain, household food reserves, and he rejected reports of starvation as excuses for grain shortages. In the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, a later Soviet leader, he noted that Kaganovich had a saying, quote, "Every Ukrainian is potentially a nationalist," end quote. This shows his position. He thought hunger was proof of resistance, not failure of policy. In his eyes, people were not starving, they were hiding food. Gareth Jones was a journalist from the UK. In an eyewitness account, he went to Ukraine illegally in March 1933. Since he spoke Russian, he didn't need to rely on Soviet guides from Ukraine. He could go straight to the source, and what he saw was chilling, to say the least. As he went to Ukraine, he saw entire communities starving and people begging for food. He also noted that the famine was universal, not localized. After leaving the USSR, Jones issued a press release in Berlin. Quote, "I walked through villages, 12 collective farms. Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no food, we are dying.'" End quote. Jones was explicit that the famine was man-made and not natural, like the Soviet propaganda said. Stalin also targeted so-called kulaks who were successful or independent farmers. and he had pretty much named anyone he didn't like a kulak or a nationalist. For the people who had the unfortunate fate of being labeled a kulak were either killed or sent to one of his many concentration camps called gulags. This was carried out by local Communist Party officials and the secret police. This weakened Ukraine's rural population before the forced famine even began. But Stalin definitely didn't care. He wanted more grain to sell off so he could buy more steel and machines for his factories. Even after poor harvest, Stalin raised grain quotas for Ukraine. Stalin was basically asking Ukraine to deliver grain when it didn't have any grain to give in the first place. While Stalin was letting people starve to death, you might be asking, what was he doing with the stolen food? Did he give the food to other starving people? No. The food was taken from families and was used as selling products so the Soviet government could make more money and take that money to fund Stalin's 5-year plan. This meant buying more machine parts for factories and building up the military. Another problem with communism is when you own nothing, you have no safety. If the farmers had owned their own land, it would be much harder for the Soviet government to take it from them. Because one of the allures of communism at that time was that there are no class differences or hierarchy, and everyone can share everything, and no one will need to own anything. The problem with this ideology is that it does not take into factor human nature and how in reality humans are very selfish, because power without consequences will always corrupt. The only people that were receiving food was the industrial workers in major cities like Moscow and Leningrad. They were top priority on Stalin's list. As you think of this situation, you might be asking yourself, why didn't the people of Ukraine leave to find food? And that's where Stalin used another weapon. He forced people to stay in Ukraine. It was like an open-air prison. Because if you didn't have an internal passport that allowed you to leave your designated location, you were stuck. Peasants were denied passports, and without a passport, you could not legally travel, buy train tickets, or settle in a city. The majority of people who got the privilege to travel were party members. In January 1933, Stalin personally approved orders to seal the borders of Soviet Ukraine. The Red Army blocked roads and forced fleeing peasants to famine zones. Another aspect of this terrible situation was the soldiers in the army who saw the suffering of the people and did nothing about it. This mainly comes from the brainwashing of society at that time. Since there was no freedom of press, any news that came out from the Communist Party was the only one. Soldiers were taught that obeying the party was more important than moral judgment. If a unit refused to enforce border controls or arrests, they could be labeled as traitors or sympathizers with kulaks. The Soviet regime deliberately dehumanized rural populations. Peasants were portrayed as backwards and disloyal. Any Ukrainian resistance was framed as a nationalistic threat, not self-defense. This made it mentally easier for soldiers to guard borders and deny food to families. Even if these people followed orders, there was no guarantee that they would be safe from Stalin's purges. Ironically, he purged the same army that helped him. But Stalin couldn't do this alone. He needed help to manage operations within Ukraine. That's where Stanislav Kosyver comes into the picture. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, which meant he had the highest authority in Ukraine. One of his roles in Ukraine was the implementation of Stalin's quotas for grain production. The government set grain production quotas for Ukraine that were based on political targets, not actual harvest yields. These quotas were higher than the total grain available. Ukraine was assigned a disproportionately large share of Soviet grain deliveries despite poor harvests in 1931. When villages could not meet quotas, which was extremely common, Kosyver supported and ordered escalating punishment measures. Some of these measures were confiscation of seeds and livestock. This went far beyond taxation and resulted in no food left for survival, which Kosyver knew. Kosyver explicitly endorsed these measurements in party communications. He was also a strong supporter of blacklisting entire villages. Blacklisting was a method for the Soviet government to enforce total control over a village when quotas were met, which were pretty common. This was one of the worst punishments a village could receive. Blacklisting is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Holodomor was not an accident. By mid-1933, some relief came, but it was very selective. And this relief only came after entire villages were emptied and any sort of self-defense was broken. The aid was only conditional and insufficient. By this point, millions were already dead. At this point, the national identity of Ukraine was destroyed, and Soviet policy was to silence anyone who spoke about this event. The only reason the Holodomor ended was because the government believed they had achieved their goals, not because they felt any remorse for what they did. The first thing they wanted to end was peasant resistance, and it was crushed when entire villages were depopulated and terrorized. Survivors only complied because there was no alternative. But Stalin feared Ukraine as a potential breakaway republic, so he wanted to destroy their autonomy as well. This was done by purging Ukrainian intellectuals like teachers, politicians, and leaders. Once these people died, then their cultural values they taught would be lost down the generations. Once again, this was another tool to destroy someone's identity. And by the spring of 1933, food reserves were completely exhausted and livestock was largely gone. The famine burned itself out because extraction could no longer continue. But the Soviet government knew that if enough people died, they wouldn't have enough peasants to work the farms, which would feed the industrial workers needed to build his war machine. One of the journalists who downplayed the intentions of the Holodomor was Walter Duranty. He was a journalist from the UK who moved to the USSR in 1921, and he became the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times from 1922 to 1936. During this time, he became an important Western journalist covering the USSR. In 1932, he won the Pulitzer Prize for a series of articles portraying the Soviet experiment as stabilizing and successful. Ironically, at the very moment mass famine was unfolding. One of the reasons he was so popular was because editors in New York relied heavily on him because there were very few alternatives. Duranty was sympathetic to the Soviet cause and often downplayed the mass starvation, stating, quote, "You can make an omelet without breaking eggs," end quote. During this time, all foreign correspondents in Moscow operated under official censorship and threats of expulsion or visa denial. So most information coming from Duranty was first approved by the Soviet government before it reached foreign countries. Duranty was very close to Soviet officials such as the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and party intermediaries who shaped foreign press. He wasn't a formal agent but shared beliefs of the Soviet government. One of the reasons Duranty refused to tell the truth was because if he did, he would have been deported from the USSR and would have lost all of his status and influence. He would have to start back from zero. While information regarding the Holodomor was slow to come out, it only came out after the collapse of the USSR when Ukraine became an independent country, where a lot of information was released. Party and NKVD documents were exposed. Orders signed by Stalin and Molotov were looked at and examined to see the results in the famine. The real numbers of deaths will never be known, but it is estimated around 3 to 5 million people died because of Stalin's policy. The Holodomor is a dark period in Ukrainian history. It shows us what happens when you are defenseless, a dark reminder that tells us we should always be prepared for the worst. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments, and if you enjoy this type of content, subscribe for future videos.